Our next presenter is Don Chen, and Don is the Director of Urban Opportunity at the Ford Foundation, where he leads the Equitable Development Team, supporting urban development strategies to reduce poverty, expand economic opportunities, and advance sustainability in cities and regions in the U.S. and in developing countries, with a focus on shaping the delivery systems for affordable housing, community improvement, infrastructure, and city and regional planning. And before joining the foundation in 2008, Don was the founder and CEO of Smart Growth America, and he's authored many pieces on land use, transportation, social equity, and environmental policy. Please join me in welcoming Don Chen.
Thanks very much. Great. Good morning, everyone. All right. Sounds like we're waning a bit. I'm Don Chen with the Ford Foundation. I'm delighted to be here and very grateful to have been invited to moderate the next panel. I'm going to introduce our speakers in a moment, but I want to frame the conversation that we're going to have on education, housing, and economic empowerment. As you read in the background materials for this session, we put these issues together because these are issues that are very deeply linked together, both in terms of policy, in terms of place, and also in terms of the lived experience of young people, of families that are living in poverty, that are trying to escape the shackles of poverty, and that is a major challenge for us to this day. I want to highlight a couple of things. The increasing understanding and notion that where a child grows up is very strongly influential on their life chances. We often use the shorthand of talking about their zip code, which determines their educational opportunities, their parents' economic opportunities, and where they ultimately can achieve the goals that they've set out for themselves. And we're going to go into some of these details about the interconnections, about the topics. I want to first pose a couple of overarching issues to our panelists, and I hope that they can incorporate their reflections on these two overarching topics. One is that the fight against segregation has been a really central part of the civil rights movement for many decades. We've seen some progress over the years. We've addressed segregation in terms of institutional segregation, looking at everything from schools to the Academy Awards. We've also addressed segregation in terms of place, in terms of geography, and in terms of where we all live. And again, we've seen some progress and also some backsliding. And as a urban planner, I think of a little more pessimistically about the spatial segregation that we face in the U.S. today. In particular, if I can just cite a couple of factoids from recent years, in the last decade we've seen a doubling of concentrated poverty in the U.S. As some of our speakers will highlight, we've seen resegregation economically and racially in our schools. We've also seen a tremendous, unprecedented loss of wealth among African American and Latino families as a result of the foreclosure crisis. And as Manuel said, Professor Pastor said, we've seen also a recent unprecedented record-setting level of unaffordability in the rental housing market, which is also squeezing people out of the neighborhoods where they live. And so there are a set of things that are really affecting cities and neighborhoods spatially. And so amid all of that bad news, all of this backsliding, I want to pose to our speakers this question: what keeps you optimistic? What makes you charged and optimistic about the type of change that we can make? So that's one question I'd like you all to think about and address. A second one is I want to stay on the points that Angela raised. She really raised these questions about sharpening our narrative, telling a different story. And we're coming off of last night's crazy debate in Detroit among the candidates, and I see increasingly a challenge of a battle of story, a battle about what America should be or what it is, what it can be. And this is a battle that's gone back and forth. Recently we saw the Dreamers, who had a very hopeful and pragmatic, compelling story that seemed to really gain some traction. And then lo and behold, we have this election where we have some really unfamiliar, crazy stories that are nonetheless coming out of the woodwork. There's a tremendous amount of anxiety in the U.S. among white voters. The story that Donald Trump is peddling is one of extreme negativity, and it makes us think that perhaps this is what happens when you spend decades just trying to freak everyone out about how terrible things are. And so it's a battle about story, and I want to ask our colleagues here, you look at the wonderful report that was put together for this conference, all the policy reforms. How can we achieve that policy agenda, this progressive agenda, if we don't achieve a change in the narrative, in the story? And how can we really change the story? So those are some questions that I'd like you to think about as you make your remarks. I'm going to introduce our speakers over here, starting to my left. We have Professor Micheri Keels from the University of Chicago. We have Tasha Tucker from Atlantic Philanthropies, Malcolm Glenn from Uber, Mark Morial from the National Urban League, and Janet Murguia from the National Council of La Raza. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and I will start asking them questions. How are you? Good to see you. Okay, I'm going to start with Malcolm. And hope you don't mind I go out of order a little bit here, but I want to build on some of the things that a couple of our speakers talked about. Angela, Manuel, others talked about the importance of connectivity and access. And you work for Uber. Many of you might be wondering, why is Uber on stage at a civil rights conference? So I think we're very curious. And we know that transportation does play a role in the civil rights field. We'd love to hear from your standpoint what those connections might be.
Absolutely. So thank you, Don. I think I was certain that you all had the same question as well, so I'm glad that Don asked to start off. There was a study that was conducted last year. It's actually a continuing study, but some really interesting results came out last year. It was a study from Harvard, Nathaniel Hendren and Raj Chetty, about the factors that most strongly contribute to how one can climb out of poverty. And the factor that emerged that was the greatest contributor to that was commute time, greater than elementary school test scores, greater than the proportion of two-parent households in a neighborhood, greater than crime. And you can imagine what that means for folks who live in underserved areas. Less access to public transportation, less access to buses, less access to taxi cabs. And you can also imagine how that's a difficult problem to solve. It takes a ton of things. It takes a great deal of political will. That means a politician having to say, hey, listen, I want to invest in a poor neighborhood. It's going to cost everyone a ton of money, and it's going to take a really long time, and it's probably going to raise everyone's taxes. It's not a great sell, and certainly it costs a lot when state budgets, local budgets are not getting bigger. And so it's important to note, to Don's point, that Uber did not set out to solve these problems. Uber was started because a guy in San Francisco wanted an opportunity for he and his friends to be able to get around at the touch of a button. But what we saw is there was an exceptionally large demand for this all around the country and frankly all around the world. And so we've grown a ton in the last 5.5 years from a guy and his friends in San Francisco to 65 countries and 370 cities around the world. And with that comes a really unique opportunity to solve some of these problems related to how underserved people get around and the access that folks who live in low-income neighborhoods have to transportation. So you can imagine the technology coupled with the existing infrastructure, so no new investment in infrastructure, the existing infrastructure being roads, and how that can transform people's lives. And so if you just look at a couple of examples, a number of folks are here from the University of Chicago. In Chicago, 6 out of 10 rides on Uber begin or end within a quarter mile of a CTA station. So that means this really valuable sort of first mile, last mile complement to public transportation. Here in DC, just across the river, in the last year, there's been an 800% increase in the number of Uber rides from Ward 7 and Ward 8, places that have traditionally never been served by taxis. If you try to hail a taxi here and try to go to Ward 7 or Ward 8, oftentimes you'll be told no. If you're trying to get a taxi from that area, oftentimes you'll be told 45 minutes or the taxi will never come. And then you imagine extrapolating that from a discrimination standpoint. If you're a black person, I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room, myself included, who have had a really difficult time getting a cab because they didn't want to go where you were going to go, or you didn't look the right way. And so it is something that, quite frankly, we have stumbled into, the recognition that we can make some really powerful change from a civil rights perspective. And I think the thing that's been really exciting for me is seeing how many people have come into the company and seeing how many people are really interested in this work and how we can grow on the changes that we've already made.
Fantastic. That's a great optimistic story. I want to move to the field of education. And Michere, Professor Keels, this is an area where we've seen very mixed results and some sobering factors over the years. One of the exciting things is that this shows up as the top priority for people in this room and beyond. So this is a set of things that it's a nut that we all have to crack. And despite losing ground, there are a lot of efforts to try to make change. You've spent part of your career really analyzing some of the more common techniques to try to reduce that inequality and improve educational quality. So I'm wondering if you can reflect on those factors.
That's a big question, lots of factors. And I'm going to try to do it with the idea of what's the optimistic story in there. Advance warning on that would have been good. The optimistic story. So the thing, I guess, that one of the things that I've been looking at the most is the kind of double jeopardy that we call it, of living in a high poverty household and attending a high poverty school, and how that then concentrates the challenges that both schools and children need to overcome in order to focus on education. So unfortunately, many of our urban schools spend a good part of their day and budgets remediating the issues that come along with poverty before being able to move on to the issue of like the content area instruction and learning. And so that is a real challenge when educational outcomes are a focus. And I guess first I'm going to start with the challenge, then hopefully the strong positive story will come out of that, or you guys will help figure out what that is. And that is our turn towards kind of market-oriented policies to solve our educational problems, being the turn to choice. And the other thing that we call portfolio schools. So the idea, we've come to the idea that what we need to do in each of our school districts is create options for families. And that by creating options, people will be able to choose their way out of poorly performing schools and choose and opt into high performing schools. And that has a whole logic about choice, right? And the idea that everyone can choose a high performing school. And so if they're not in a high performing school, the onus is then back on families and back on individuals for the educational outcomes that we get, rather than the framework of, well, every family and every child, instead of deserving choice, they deserve a neighborhood school that they would automatically be enrolled in as being the institution that's of high quality. And so it's the kind of where do we put the onus for providing kids a strong education? And we've come to the idea that choice, we can choose our way out of things. We've been using that for some of our housing policies. The idea that if we give housing choice vouchers, then families can choose and opt out of high poverty, low opportunity neighborhoods into stronger, higher opportunity neighborhoods, and then get better outcomes for themselves and their children. But we are increasingly finding that this logic and this framework is not working. And focusing on schools, one of the things that we're increasingly finding is that there are barriers to entry into choice. So not everyone even understands how the choice process works in their school district. And even if you get past that first barrier and understand how the choice process works, you have to be able to get your child to school, because many of the choice options don't come with a public school bus. So there are actually, we're finding many financial and other and informational barriers to choice, such that to the extent that choice allows you to opt into stronger performing schools, it tends to be the more advantaged families that are in that district that opt into those higher performing schools. There's a lot of issue about what counts as a high performing school. And instead, what happens is it increases the level of both racial and socioeconomic segregation in the neighborhood schools. So as we increase the amount of choice in a school district, we also increase the disparity in the schooling context that the kids are in. And so this can create an interesting false framework in that some of our neighborhoods that are gentrifying or revitalizing, it depends on whether you're seeing the benefits of that neighborhood change or on whether the neighborhood is kind of changing around you and maybe pushing you out in costs, whether you see it as a gentrification that's happening or revitalization that's happening. But either way, we get a false picture sometimes where there's socioeconomic change happening in the neighborhood. So we're saying, wait, this neighborhood is more diverse. And that maybe by doing that, we are improving the schools that are attached to that neighborhood. But when we look at the schools, what we actually find is that the schools are just as segregated, both racially and ethnically and socioeconomically than before, or sometimes even more so, because all of the families that moved in that have any kind of means opt out of that neighborhood school. And so, in a sense, that's a challenge that we have to deal with as we are increasing urban renewal, or back to the city movements and things like that. How does that play against choice, school choice, and the fact that those families are not all entering into an umbrella, one umbrella school that would kind of create the interaction, because that's where we meet families. That's where, if there was going to be cross socioeconomic interaction, it would happen in the neighborhood school. But now people actually get to opt out of that. And I have in Chicago and in other schools, Boston is another one, school districts, some of those families that are moving into those neighborhoods are starting to say, instead of giving us choice as the way to get our kids into a good school, what we all deserve is a strong neighborhood school. So there are families themselves that are middle-income families that are moving into these and revitalizing these neighborhoods, trying to say, we actually don't want, our preference is not to opt out of the school, our preference is to try to figure out how to fix these neighborhood schools, and so that we can send our kids there and have some of this interaction that's supposed to happen. So there is hope.
Fantastic. And Tasha, you've worked on education policy as well, various dimensions. Building on what Professor Keels mentioned, you've worked on community schools as well from the standpoint of a different sector in philanthropy. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on that work and the role of philanthropy in this field. And also you've done some work on school and school discipline. So I would love to hear about that as well.
Sure. So thank you, Don, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here today. Let me just, express my appreciation to you and the other panelists in the University of Chicago for putting on really this wonderful event. So for those of you who don't know Atlantic, we are a limited life foundation, really just dedicated to increasing knowledge and opportunity for disadvantaged and vulnerable people. Our grants have served various jurisdictions around the world, from South Africa to Vietnam, Ireland, and the United States. So a consistent theme across all of our work has really just to change unfair and discriminatory policies and practices and structures. So we've done this in various ways, but our school discipline reform work, started in 2010, and really just as a result of the growing number of suspensions and expulsions and the application of zero tolerance discipline affecting communities of color. So from 2010 to 2014, Atlantic invested $47 million in raising awareness about the school to prison pipeline, also to test and disseminate discipline alternatives, and to support grassroots and advocacy organizations really putting pressure on the work on the ground. So since then, we have really seen some tremendous gains, not only in the states and districts where we've supported, but just really a shift in narrative about zero tolerance discipline. I think when we started this work, we saw that zero tolerance discipline was the standard, and what most people thought is that these dangerous kids don't deserve to be in the classroom. And now there's an approach to fairness and just a realization that zero tolerance discipline and expulsions and suspensions are counterproductive to the educational process. And also in our community schools work, which we've supported since 2010 through our work with Elevate, what we did is really focus on 4 jurisdictions, Chicago, Oakland, New Mexico, and also Baltimore, to expand community schools. And in these community schools, these programs basically focus on the middle grades, which we all know that are very critical, for our students. These programs really did 4 things. They expanded sort of the options for students in school and out of school with various activities that provided high quality health care to students through school-based health centers. Really encouraged parents to have more involvement in their kids' education, and then also focused on parents to improve their education and their investment in their kids' life trajectory. But Atlantic is wrapping up its limited life, and just 2 years ago in 2014, as we are trying to close, we aim to sort of shift our work to have a more intersectional frame. So we moved from these program areas to a theme-based approach, and I've had the opportunity to work on our racial equity work, which is one of these themes. From our work, we realize that a kid is just not suspended or just doesn't need health care, that they sort of need supports across the board, and we really need to build the infrastructure of our racial equity organizations across the country to really finish our work as we are kind of exiting the field.
Great, thank you. And to stay on the education point, Janet, I know you've spent quite a bit of time and effort, your organization, on Every Student, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so far we've talked about pretty specific interventions. This is a more comprehensive approach, and I would love to hear your insights into how this particular act gives us an opportunity to address things in a more comprehensive way.
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about that. I think it's important to kind of lay some of the other groundwork around the issue of education as well, and pleased to be here to have a chance to talk about that. Look, poll after poll, whether it comes Latino community, African American community, this room this morning, what's the most important issue? Education. Everyone always believes that education is the most important issue, and it's because it is. Everyone sees that as the key to opportunity, to empowerment, and to success. And so when we look at the National Council of RASA, obviously, we have focused a lot on the Latino community, the largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization in the country. But the truth is, as we have a lens today, as we look at all communities of color, the fact is that as in kindergartens across the country today, children 5 and under are majority minority populations in this country. That pipeline of these new changing profile of our schools and our classrooms has already begun. And in most urban areas, it's already true. We already are seeing majority, minority, or communities of color in these classrooms. So then the issue is, are we using the best strategies? Are we investing in the right ways to make sure that these students who have had challenges, a lot of times because they've been in high poverty areas, are getting the best possible opportunities to succeed in education. And I guess I would start first by saying, you know, when we know as a fact that preschool can give every child that first best literal head start on their educational attainment, and we still see too many children of color underserved when it comes to Head Start, we have a big problem there, and it's a big gap. And I think it's unacceptable that we would still see so many disproportionately children of color left out of early and preschool programs, early child and Head Start programs. So we need to address that issue early on. And what I believe, as we're seeing now this change with the ESSA law, the Every Student Succeeds law, which was not a perfect law, but it is the law, and now we have to make sure that it's working for our families. The key to me is the lens of advocacy. We need to make sure that increasingly, more and more, our parents, our families, and our communities have a voice in advocating for the changes that we want for our kids in the school system, for the investments that we need to see. Now, as a result of this change of this law, which is a civil rights law in education, we now are going to be seeing more and more the states and local school districts having to create plans for accountability as to how they are serving all their children, including our kids. For all of us, it's going to be, this is a huge shift. Please be clear about it. If we want to see our children succeed more and more, it isn't about the Department of Education coming from a federal lens on this to either try to step in and save or intercede. It's going to be all of us who are going to need to be accountable to make sure that those accountability plans at the local and state level have the benchmarks that will make sure our kids are not left out when we're measuring whether they are progressing or succeeding in school. It's going to be very important for us to be advocates and to make sure our communities know how to be advocates in this space. For us in the Latino community, it becomes even more important, I believe, because 40% of our kids are still English learners, trying to make sure that they are fully able to engage in mainstream classrooms and not be left behind. One of the benchmarks that was in this Every Student Succeeds Act is the fact that now schools will have to have accountability plans that account for English learners. But we, as advocates for our community, have to make sure that there are training programs going on so that our parents can be fully engaged and our community leaders can be fully engaged. We know that the school system can be overwhelming, but we also know that our parents are challenged with a lot of the other issues of several jobs, part-time jobs, the time and management of being able to stay engaged in their children's lives. We have to change the culture in our communities to make sure that we are clear that their voice has to be present in PTA meetings, in parent-student meetings, in making sure school board meetings, our voices are heard. That has to be a new phenomenon for us, or our children will not be getting those resources, the attention, and the investments that they deserve. And I think for us, that advocacy, that megaphone, obviously has to be now centered in a very strategic way on those elected officials, those administration officials who can step in and help. But I do believe that we can encourage our partners and allies in the business community, in the corporate sector, who say they care about education as well, to be part of a coalition that is invested in the future pipeline of their workforce so that they can help make sure that our kids are going to meet the needs of filling those jobs of the 21st century. It is essential that we not be alone in this, our kids cannot be alone in this, but that we need to build that coalition that's going to allow that to happen. I'll close by saying, I give a good example. Everybody seems to want to make sure all our kids are very highly educated and having that educational attainment. We want that too. Again, I look at early childhood education and I think, why aren't we making sure that every child has access to preschool and early childhood education when we know that will make a marked difference? Why is it that we can't get business community leaders to make sure they're advocating for early childhood education and look at their pipeline as it is today, at those kindergartners who are going to be filling that workforce? And why aren't they up on Capitol Hill helping us advocate for early childhood education policies and acceptance of change in all of those areas as well? We have to make sure we're leveraging our voice now more than ever. And I'll say something to our foundations, friends who have been helpful in sponsoring this. There has to be a paradigm shift in how we are holding these school systems accountable. And we need to be making sure we're making investments in those community leaders and families to be trained, to have the skills, to be able to be those advocates. You want to ask me what makes me optimistic? Our people make me optimistic. They care about their kids, but we've got to give them the tools to make sure that they can do what they need to do. If we give them a little bit of help in how they can be good advocates for their kids in education, then we can see the changes that are going to need to be made if we're going to have the strong future economically for them and for this country.
Fantastic. Yes, and excellent. And you talk about the importance of paradigm shift and changing the culture. And we also, one of the challenges is that a lot of the policies that we're talking about, practices, tools, they're really shifting from the national to the local, as you say. And Mayor Maurial, you are mayor of an important city in the United States. Wonder if you can share your perspective on this range of issues that we've discussed, the need to really work not just in the, the halls of the legislature over here, but also, but also in the state houses and city halls.
Yeah, so first of all, good morning and thank you, and amen to everybody up here. They did a great job and offered a great deal of perspective. And let me thank the University of Chicago. I want to thank Elena, Derek, the team for pulling us together, but really for understanding the connectivity between civil rights and urban public policy. And all too often it's thought of separately, and I think thinking of them together is what the 21st century really ought to be about, because the cities have always been on the cutting edges of inclusion, on the cutting edges of pushing, if you will, for there to be public policies to lift up those who've been historically locked out and left out. So I especially want to thank you all for doing that. A lot I want to say, but let me kind of take your question, but also take sort of Angela's challenge about framing. So, the current debate in the country that we see played out in the presidential election suggests with great emphasis that the United States of America is at the crossroads. On one hand, there is a narrative which essentially says, let us repeal the 20th century. Let us repeal the 20th century. Let us cut $500 billion out of the federal operating budget, and let's start with the Department of Education and the Environmental Protection Agency, which were both created in the post-civil rights era to address the transformation of the country in the second half of the 20th century. Let us focus on having a federal government that has a strong military, and let everything else be secondary and an afterthought. Make no mistake about it. While not framed explicitly that way, the narrative is a narrative about essentially repealing the 20th century, or at the very least, the second half of the 20th century. On the other hand, there's a narrative that wants to embrace the promise of the American future. which is a promise of a multicultural, pluralistic democracy, which as such, the United States becomes first in humankind to be a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy that also can say we are the largest and most influential nation in the world. Never been the case. You go back to the Greeks, go back to the Romans, the Ethiopians, the Syrians, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire. And that's what's at stake. It's a clear debate about what I call a battle between the future and the past. So when you embrace the past, the language is language of paranoia, fear, walls, division, caricatures of people being less entitled to sit at the American table of prosperity because of religion, race, country of origin, gender identity, or tomorrow make up something else. And that's what's at stake. And that is what is at stake. And so, to a great extent, what the narrative should be is about the narrative of hope and optimism for the future. So what makes me optimistic? To think about a 1952 Thurgood Marshall who went to the Supreme Court, argued Brown v. Board the first time, felt like he did a very poor job, and the word came back from the court that they were going to lose, and the Supreme Court was going to uphold Plessy. Guess what happened? The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court died. Earl Warren became Chief Justice. Brown v. Board was re-argued, and the rest is history. What makes me optimistic is Rosa Parks, is Cesar Chavez. What makes me optimistic are all of the people who came before us who faced greater difficulties than we faced, who faced no sense of hope, but they toiled and they fought because they had a vision and they had a notion of creating an America, and there are many in that generation, that was for us and better for us. So what should make us optimistic is, as Janet said, our people, and what should make us optimistic is what we want for our children and children's children. That's what ought to make us optimistic. We don't have a choice. To not be optimistic is to be selfish, is to be thinking only about now, our generation, and what we need to do now. We, in an effort at the National Urban League to confront the framing, 5 years ago created and decided that we were going to position all of our work around 4 aspirational goals. 1 in education, 1 in housing, 1 in jobs, and 1 in health. And that we were going to do, whether we do programs, thought leadership, public policy, research, we were going to try to put it in one of those areas. Then, 3 years ago, approximately 60 national civil rights organizations came together around the anniversary of the March on Washington and put together this 21st Century Agenda for Jobs and Freedom, which is a comprehensive set of recommendations about the future of this country with a distinct focus on communities of color and a distinct focus on African Americans. Then, most recently, if you follow the media, we invited every single presidential candidate, every single one, to participate in a briefing opportunity with 9 historic civil rights organizations so we could present this document to them. 2 accepted, Secretary Clinton and Senator Sanders, and we briefed them on the recommendations in this document. So what is key? We have got to focus on the intersection between civic engagement, public policy, and governing. It means nothing to elect someone as a mayor or city council member, a state legislator, a governor, president, or Congress if they get into office and they do not have a notion about how to operationalize the change we're talking about in this room. And therefore this effort here in this room has to continue beyond next January. And this effort has to continue in an effort to educate, inculcate, socialize, and hold accountable elected officials and people who end up serving in government to advocate for and fight for the kind of public policy changes that we absolutely need and want. I'll close with this to show you how planning takes place. I was in a conversation recently. These conversations happened in a basketball game with a perfect stranger, new friend I met. He shared with me that he was invited in 1999 to be part of a quiet work group put together by a group of high-profile defense hawks from the neocon camp, 1999. And the purpose of that work group was to plan for the invasion of Iraq. What is the point? The point is that there were people preparing for what foreign policy would look like even a year and a half before an election took place. And therefore our ideas, public policy, cannot live on paper, in our heads, simply in high-minded thought and language. We have to spend more time on how to operationalize it, and we have to also spend more time helping parents, helping people who are not as in the loop, connected to these kinds of discussions as I, on how to understand how and why and what we ought to be fighting for to improve the quality of life. So I look forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for a question. So whoever can raise their hand the highest, I will choose. Let's see, over here, right over here. And do we have a mic runner? Yes.
Eileen Schlepp, Creative Alliance Communications. I came out of the Department of Education, have all my degrees, and 2 years ago I decided to go teach in the DC public schools as a permanent sub. And I saw on the ground a model of what we need to do. But even though policy is critical, and I think all of you have been awesome, we need to look at our teachers. We need to look at our principals because they don't have the empowerment tools needed to really, really produce. I saw what could happen when we all worked together and we had 2 people in a classroom. I saw a wonderful model, and I think we really need to look at what's happening on the ground. And I wanted your comments.
Well, I just think it goes, I would argue that policy with advocacy is essential. You can't have one without the other because you don't get the change that Mark talked about. So you have to make sure that though our families, our parents, our community leaders have the tools and the training to be able to engage teachers speak on behalf of supporting teachers, engage principals, speak on behalf of supporting strong schools, and speak to school board members and others and anybody who is accountable for that oversight and supervision. But if we don't give our parents and our community leaders the right tools with the right training, more and more, that is going to be essential. And I would just say that advocacy piece is growing and is going to be even more important as we combine policy with it to achieve the change ultimately. It's about implementing policy. And if you don't have the right tools in place, the policy is something that's written on paper, and it's not something that we're actually seeing implemented. And that's going to be so essential, the implementation. But we've got to give our parents and our community leaders the tools and the knowledge necessary to do that. They have the desire to want to see their kids succeed and to want to see the change. But sometimes they need a little bit of help to be able to make sure that they can get those changes.
May I ask you a question? How significant was it to have two people working in each classroom? Is that were you making that point as an important point?
In our classrooms, yes. And we had different levels of bilingual education. We also had some very troubled kids mixed in our class. Because when the charter schools don't want a student, they push them over to the DC public schools. The teachers worked as a team. That's what the model is good. I thought it really, in the end, happened at the teacher level. And no one went home at 3:30. The parents could have breakfast with us. We met as a team over each troubled child. But in some of the classes, you had a teacher assistant, low paid, who were amazing. So I'm not saying it has to be always two teachers. We had some of the teacher aides were so sophisticated.
TA or something, yeah. Teacher's aide, sort of.
But really, really trained. We had people coming in from the district to monitor the teachers that didn't have any of the credentials the teachers had. I was a little awed by the level of teachers that we had and how they never went home.
Any other comments?
So I guess I would just, following up on not necessarily the specific of having two teachers in a classroom, but having the resources necessary to get the outcome that you want. It could be two teachers. It could be one teacher with a smaller classroom. So the model that one might use to get the desired outcome is the goal, not necessarily having two teachers in the classroom. And when we talk about telling the story and everything like that, right now we seem to have a lot of trouble telling the story that if you invest the resources in education, you get a return on the dollar, versus investing those resources in incarceration and policing and all of those other things where you don't get a return on the dollar, such as we know that crime spikes immediately after school between like 3 and 6, which is a period when kids get out, but parents aren't home yet. And we've invested the resources in increasing policing during that period of time rather than investing the resources in increasing supervised after-school programs. And it's this, what outcome do you want and where do you put the resource to get it? But we can make that argument for policing, but can't make the argument for increased after-school supervised activities.
I was going to make this point because I think we've got to make sure make sure this is central to the agenda, and that is resource equity. The system of financing public education in this country is neither adequate nor equitable. And I'll give you an example. So ESSA, which is basically a bill which sets a set of requirements, conditions that states have to meet to receive federal dollars. I think the commitment of dollars to ESSA may be equivalent to what we spend in 1 year is equivalent to what we may spend in 2 months in Iraq. See, we don't have the priorities correct, right, around what we invest in. And then secondly, I just read something yesterday that the profit per inmate for private correctional corporations is approximately $2,500 per capita. So if we are successful in trying to reform the criminal justice system, then what we ought to be talking about doing is repatriating the savings that may come from the $50 billion that states spend on jails into productive things like education. So, I mean, we have to sharpen some of these. Look, the resource equity issue, the Supreme Court case on that lost 15 or 20 years ago in a 5-4 vote. See, we have to hope against hope. We're going to get an opportunity to revisit some issues, right, in the future, which is why what is at stake is so high, right? The opportunity where some things have been stuck, that we can move them again.
Okay, please join me in thanking our great panelists.